contrast with using either a for loop or a while loop, specifically when we're going to do what's called nested loops. And what we mean by nested loops is putting one looping structure as the body of another looping structure. This is a technique we use a lot. This is going to come up in a lot of our algorithms. For this algorithm, here's what we're going to print. You don't have to type this into your notes if you don't want to, but I just want you to know where we're headed. We're going to print values that look like this. There we go. 8 lines with these numbers in it, okay? And we're going to do that using nested loops. And we're going to do it in 2 different ways. First, we're going to do it with a for loop. Public static void, nested loop 1. And we're going to focus more on how we decide what values to have for our variables when we do this. Today, we're just going to focus on the structure of nested loops. Later this week, we'll dive more into how we can use them different algorithmic ways. So I'm going to start with a for loop. Because we're now doing nested loops, I'm going to write my for loop on one line because otherwise visually it gets hard to see what's going on. So I'm going to say for int I equals 1. This is my outer loop is the term we use. I want it to keep running while I is less than or equal to 2. And I'm going to say I plus plus. And then I have the body of my for loop. Inside of the outer loop, I'm going to put another for loop. And because it's a second for loop, I need to use a different variable name because I already used I. I can't redeclare it. So I'm going to use j. I'm going to say for j equals 1, keep running while j is less than or equal to 4, j plus plus. And that's what nested for loops look like. And then in the body of the inner loop, I'll do system.out.println, and I'm going to print the value of I, followed by a space, followed by the value of j. And if you compile and run this little example, it's going to print what I put in the comment up above. One common thing to check when you write nested for loops or just nested loops in general is calculate, hey, how many times will this innermost statement actually run? And the way you figure that out is you look at your innermost loop and you say, well, how many times is this going to run? It's going to run 4 times for every 1 time that this outer loop runs. All right, well, how many times does the outer loop run? It runs twice. So 2 times 4 is 8. I'm going to print 8 different lines. Hey, that's what I want. That's a good sign. Sometimes you'll go through that thought exercise and realize like, wow, I'm printing way more lines than I want to. Something's got to be off in my approach. Let me reevaluate. But it's a good check. Definitely a good check. Let's code this in a second way. Let's use a while loops. Public static void nested loop 2. Now, when we use a while loop, we have to declare the local variable first. So I'll say int I equals 1. Then we can have the while statement with our condition, while I is less than or equal to 2, and have our block. I'll need another local variable, int j equals 1. And then I can say while j is less than or equal to 4, and have another block. And then I can print the value of I, a space, and the value of j. And then I have to be careful because I need to make sure I increment j inside the body of the inner loop, and I need to increment I inside the body of the outer loop. And this code will print exactly the same thing. Again, how we decide what number to start I and j at, and how we decide what number to end I and j at, we'll focus on later this week. Right now, we're just focusing on the structure. And really, I just want you to focus on comparing and contrasting the two of these. I'm going to leave the while loop on the right screen, put the for loop on the left screen, and just visually, the for loop is a lot more straightforward. So what I'm going to try to convince you of in the next minute is that even if you're more comfortable with a while loop because you're more familiar with it, when doing nested loops in particular, please use the for loop. You will make less mistakes. It's going to go a lot better because everything has a place. You can't put the increments in the wrong place. You can't initialize the loop variables in the wrong place because they're all built into the for statement. It's like designed for this. It's really good for this. What I see too often, so here I'll share with you the experience of those who've come before you so you don't experience their same like pain and frustration. Too often students leave this out. They forget the J++. This loop runs forever, never stops, okay? Or they leave out the I++, and the outer loop runs forever and never stops. Or they put the I++ in the wrong place, and this loop runs forever and never stops, okay? The most common thing I see is that they initialize both of their loop variables here, and therefore the second iteration of the outer loop, they don't reinitialize J to 1. It has a value of 5, and this never runs, and they don't know why. Okay. There are so many opportunities to put these different parts of a looping structure in the wrong place when you have nested while loops. Whereas with for loops, it's much more straightforward. I'm not saying that there aren't pitfalls. There are. And the most common is I think students, or not just students, coders, read this first line as they're typing the second line, and they know they need a new variable here, but they forget that by the time they get to here, and they do like I++ here. And then this loop runs forever because the value of J never changes. So there are pitfalls with nested for loops as well. There's just so fewer. Okay. So that's what I'm imploring you today. Try out these for loops, especially as we do nested for loops.